You find yourself in the scorching heat of ancient Persia in the year 401 BC, standing in the shadow of a massive palace that rises like a mountain against the blazing desert sky. The air shimmers with heat waves, and the scent of burning incense mingles with something far more sinister. Sinister. Before you lie two wooden boats, carefully crafted and fitted together with terrifying precision. But whispers follow in their wake because everyone knows the horrifying truth. That apparatus before the most powerful empire in the world was designed for one of the most disturbing acts of systematic torture in recorded history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of ancient excess. It's the story of how absolute power can transform justice into obsession, honor into madness, and a human being into a living example created to serve one empire's twisted concept of control. The name Mithridates might not be familiar to you, but his story will haunt you long after you finish listening. You are standing in that courtyard, watching as guards drag a young man toward those boats. His name is Mithridates, barely 22 years old, with the kind of classical Persian features that would have made him welcome in any noble household. His dark hair, usually oiled and carefully arranged in the Persian fashion, now hangs in matted strands around his angular face. His brown eyes, once bright with the confidence of youth and military training, now dart frantically between the boats and the assembled crowd. His hands, calloused from years of sword work and spear throwing, shake uncontrollably as iron shackles bite into his wrists. This is a man who just days ago was celebrated as a hero, who had saved an empire with a single perfectly aimed spear throw. Let's start with the man who would become the architect of this tragedy. Artaxerxes II wasn't born evil. In fact, his early reign showed remarkable promise. When he ascended to the throne as King of Kings, many Persians believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. He was tall for a Persian, standing nearly 6 feet, with the kind of regal bearing that made even foreign ambassadors bow deeper than protocol required. His beard was meticulously maintained in the royal fashion, oiled with precious scents from India and braided with threads of gold. His eyes, an unusual shade of green that court poets claimed was a gift from Ahura Mazda himself, seemed to see everything, understand everything, control everything. He expanded trade routes that brought silk from China and ivory from Africa. He funded public works that employed thousands of craftsmen. He even showed mercy to defeated enemies that impressed the ancient world. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls. And by 401 BC, something had fundamentally broken inside the emperor's mind. Maybe it was the constant paranoia that comes with knowing everyone around you wants your position. Maybe it was the isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted, never be challenged, never be told they were wrong. Or maybe it was what happened to the one person who dared to claim credit for the deed that saved his throne. The year was 401 BC. The Persian Empire stretched from the Indus River to the Mediterranean Sea, encompassing more territory than any realm before it. At its heart sat Artaxerxes II, but even this godlike figure faced challenges that would test the very foundations of his power. His younger brother, Cyrus, had gathered Greek mercenaries and Persian dissidents, marching against the throne in a bid that would reshape the ancient world. Picture the Battle of Cunaxa, the dust cloud so thick you couldn't see your own hand extended in front of your face. The screams of dying men and horses creating a symphony of horror that echoed across the desert. The clash of bronze against bronze that rang like thunder, drowning out even the war cries of 10,000 men. And somewhere in that chaos, as Cyrus himself charged toward his brother's position with a spear aimed at the King of Kings, a young soldier named Mithridates acted. Mithridates had been raised in the military tradition of the Persian Empire, in a small village near Persepolis where boys learned to ride before they could properly walk. His father had been a minor satrap, loyal to the crown, who had filled his son's head with stories of honor and duty and service to the King of Kings. Mithridates learned to throw a spear with deadly accuracy, to fight with sword and shield, to endure pain without crying out. He believed that glory lay in protecting the realm from those who would tear it apart. When the battle lines formed at Cunaxa, Mithridates stood with the loyal forces, his heart pounding with the kind of nervous excitement that every young warrior knows before his first major engagement. He watched as Cyrus, mounted on a magnificent war horse and surrounded by his elite guard, charged directly toward the royal position. Time seemed to slow. The prince's spear was aimed directly at Artaxerxes' chest. In another heartbeat, the King of Kings would be dead, and the empire would belong to a usurper. That's when Mithridates threw his spear. It was a perfect cast, the kind that warriors dream about and bards sing of for generations. The iron point took Cyrus in the throat, just below his helmet's chin guard. The prince toppled from his horse like a felled tree, his blood soaking into the desert sand, and with his death, the rebellion collapsed. But here's where the story takes its dark turn. Because when the battle was over and the victory celebrated, Artaxerxes stood before his assembled court in the great hall of Persepolis. Torches flickered against walls covered in relief carvings showing the king receiving tribute from conquered nations. The air was heavy with incense and the nervous breathing of hundreds of nobles who knew that their lives depended on their sovereign's mood. "Behold," Artaxerxes proclaimed, his voice carrying easily across the vast chamber. "I myself struck down the traitor Cyrus. With my own hand I preserved the empire from destruction." The crowd cheered. The nobles bowed so low their foreheads touched the marble floor. And Mithridates felt something cold and terrible settling in his stomach. Because it wasn't true. Days passed. Mithridates wrestled with what he'd heard. He spoke to fellow soldiers who had witnessed the battle. He consulted with his father, who advised caution, but couldn't hide his own confusion. Finally, unable to bear the weight of the lie that was being carved into official histories and sung by court poets, Mithridates made a decision that would cost him everything. "My king," he said, his voice somehow carrying across the sudden silence of the throne room during the next court gathering. Every conversation stopped, every breath held. "It was I who killed Cyrus. My spear found its mark." You could have heard a mouse walking across the marble floors. The temperature in that room didn't just drop, it plummeted into something that felt like the breath of death itself. Because in Persian court culture, the king's word wasn't just law, it was divine truth. To contradict it wasn't merely insubordination. It was an assault on the cosmic order itself. Artaxerxes didn't speak immediately. His green eyes, those eyes that poets claimed were gifts from the gods, fixed on Mithridates with an expression that made hardened warriors step backward involuntarily. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the courtiers in the back had to strain to hear him. "What did you say?" Mithridates was young. He was proud. He had saved the empire and wanted the recognition he deserved. He couldn't have known that his moment of honesty would condemn him to 17 days of agony that would redefine human understanding of suffering. "I said, my lord, that it was my spear that killed Prince Cyrus. I was there. I saw his charge. I made the cast that brought him down." The silence stretched on until it became almost unbearable. Then Artaxerxes smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Guards," he said softly, "arrest this confused young man. Perhaps a night in the dungeons will help clear his memory." But Mithridates' fate had already been sealed. That night, as he lay in chains in a cell beneath the palace, scribes worked by lamplight to research the most terrible punishment in Persian law. By morning, they had their answer. The sentence came the next day. Not death. Death would have been mercy. Death would have been quick. Instead, Artaxerxes pronounced a punishment so rare, so terrible, that even hardened Persian executioners grew pale at the words. Let him face the boats. Scaphism. From the Greek word meaning boats, but the practice was entirely Persian, refined over generations into the most horrific form of execution imaginable. It was reserved for the worst crimes, treason, patricide, and now, apparently, telling the truth when the king preferred lies. You are still standing in that courtyard, watching as the process begins with careful preparation. Two boats have been selected, carved from sturdy cedar and shaped to fit together with horrifying precision. These aren't crude vessels, but carefully crafted instruments of prolonged torture. Their construction supervised by master carpenters who have perfected their grim craft over decades of royal service. The boats are beautiful in their way, decorated with intricate carvings of lions and eagles that seem to mock the horror of their purpose. Holes have been cut with mathematical precision to accommodate a human head, arms, and legs, ensuring that these extremities will remain exposed to the elements while the torso remains sealed within the wooden prison. Mithridates is stripped naked, his body pale and trembling in the desert heat. You can see every detail of his physique, the muscles developed from years of military training, now useless against his fate. The small scar on his left shoulder from a practice sword, the calluses on his hands from gripping spear shafts. This is a human being, reduced to an object of royal justice. He's forced to lie on his back in the lower boat, his head falling back so that his throat is exposed, vulnerable. His arms and legs are positioned so that when the upper boat is secured, only his head, hands, and feet will remain visible. The executioners work with professional efficiency, adjusting his position to ensure optimal suffering. Iron bolts bind the two halves together, creating a sealed chamber that will become both coffin and breeding ground. The first horror is the forced feeding. Guards appear with clay vessels filled with a mixture of honey and milk, the same substances used in Persian religious ceremonies to honor the gods. But there is nothing sacred about this ritual. They grab Mithridates' head, forcing his mouth open while he struggles uselessly against his wooden prison. "Please," he gasps, his voice already hoarse from shouting. "Please, I only spoke the truth. I served the empire faithfully. I saved the King of Kings himself." But his pleas fall on deaf ears. The guards have methods for dealing with resistance. Sharp bronze needles appear, pricking at his eyes until survival instinct forces him to swallow the sickly sweet mixture. He gags, nearly choking, but they pour more into his mouth until his stomach distends with the unwanted nourishment. The feeding serves multiple purposes, each more horrific than the last. It keeps the victim alive for maximum suffering, providing just enough nutrition to prevent merciful death from starvation. It provides material for the inevitable waste that will accumulate within the boats, creating conditions of unimaginable filth. And it demonstrates the complete helplessness of the condemned. Mithridates can no longer control when or what he eats. Every aspect of his existence is now subject to his executioner's will. After the forced feeding comes the application of more honey and milk mixture. The guards smear it generously across his face, working it into his hair, painting his lips and cheeks until he looks like some grotesque parody of a festival celebrant. They coat his hands methodically, forcing the sticky substance between his fingers under his nails. His feet receive the same treatment, the honey worked between his toes and across the soles. The sweetness serves as an irresistible lure for insects, particularly flies, which begin to gather even before the application is complete. You can see them forming dark clouds in the air, drawn by the scent of honey and the salt of Mithridates' tears. But the honey and milk serve another, more sinister purpose. Mixed with saliva and natural oils, they create a perfect breeding ground for bacterial growth, hastening the onset of infection and decay. The boats are then positioned in the palace courtyard with scientific precision to ensure maximum sun exposure. Palace astronomers have calculated the exact angles needed to keep the victim's head in direct sunlight for the greatest number of hours each day. Mithridates' head is secured so that his eyes face directly into the blazing Persian sun, causing immediate and ongoing damage to his vision. Within hours, his eyes begin to swell and tear constantly. The tears mix with the honey on his face, creating sticky streams that attract even more insects. His lips crack and bleed under the relentless heat, while his scalp begins to burn and blister where his hair has been soaked with the honey mixture. By the end of the first day, the flies have arrived in force. They swarm around the honey-coated flesh in writhing black masses, their buzzing creating a sound like distant thunder. They crawl into his mouth when he opens it to scream. They explore his nostrils, his ears, the corners of his eyes. Some are already laying eggs in the crevices of his exposed flesh, tiny white specks that will hatch into maggots within days. Mithridates screams until his voice cracks and fails, but the sound only seems to attract more insects. His throat becomes raw and swollen, making each breath an agony. His exposed skin begins to redden and blister under the relentless sun, while inside the boats, his own waste begins to accumulate, creating an environment of unimaginable filth. The crowds that gather to witness this spectacle are as much a part of the punishment as the physical torture itself. Royal justice is always performed before an audience and Mithridates' execution draws spectators from across the empire. Merchants interrupt their trading, closing their stalls to witness what happens to those who contradict the King of Kings. Farmers abandon their fields for the day, traveling for hours to see the boats. Entire families make expeditions to the palace, bringing food and water for what they know will be a long show. They set up temporary camps in the courtyard, creating a festival atmosphere around one man's unimaginable suffering. Children play games while their parents discuss the progression of decay, noting changes in the victim's appearance from day to day. Some bring offerings to the gods, praying either for the victim's swift death or for divine protection from similar punishment. Others come purely for entertainment, viewing the prolonged execution as a form of macabre theater. The reaction of the crowd is carefully observed by royal officials who gauge public mood and the effectiveness of their deterrent measures by watching how people respond to the spectacle. They note which nobles seem uncomfortable, which ones laugh at the victim's plight, which ones pray for mercy. All of this information feeds back to the king, helping him understand the political impact of his justice. But this isn't random cruelty. This is systematic torture refined through practice and observation into a precise instrument of state terror. The punishment has been designed to maximize suffering while preventing premature death, requiring careful calibration of multiple variables that Persian executioners have perfected over generations. The boats must be tight enough to prevent escape, but loose enough to allow circulation of air and the movement of insects. Too tight and the victim dies of suffocation before the demonstration of power can be completed. Too loose and he might somehow work free of his bonds. The feeding schedule must provide sufficient nutrition to sustain life without allowing the victim to build strength that might help him endure the ordeal with dignity. The positioning must balance sun exposure for insect attraction against the risk of fatal heat stroke that would end the punishment too quickly. Persian executioners have developed expertise in managing these complex requirements, passing down their knowledge through generations of royal service like a grim family tradition. They learn to recognize the signs of imminent death and to adjust the treatment accordingly, sometimes providing shade during the hottest part of the day or increasing fluid intake when dehydration threatens to end the punishment prematurely. On the third day, you watch as the first maggots begin to hatch from the eggs laid by the flies. They emerge as tiny white worms, no larger than rice grains, but they grow quickly in the warm, moist environment created by the honey and Mithridates' bodily fluids. They begin to tunnel through his flesh, creating additional wounds that become infected and attract more insects. His face has swollen beyond recognition, his features disappearing beneath layers of blisters and insect bites. His eyes, once bright with youth and confidence, are now barely visible, slits weeping constant streams of infected fluid. The honey in his hair has attracted wasps, which sting him repeatedly, each injection of venom adding to his agony. Days pass in this living hell, each one worse than the last. Mithridates' exposed skin blisters and burns under the relentless sun, while his internal organs slowly succumb to bacterial infection. Dehydration causes his lips to crack and his tongue to swell, making even the forced drinking of honey and milk an agony that brings no relief. The constant exposure to his own waste causes chemical burns on the lower portion of his body, adding another layer of torment to his existence. His hands and feet, the only parts of his body visible to the crowds, begin to change color as circulation fails and infection sets in. The flesh takes on hues that shouldn't exist on living tissue, deep purples and sickly yellows that make even hardened spectators turn away. By the end of the first week, Mithridates has lost the ability to speak coherently. his mind destroyed by pain, dehydration, and the toxic effects of systemic infection. His mumbled words are unintelligible, a constant stream of pleading and prayer that no one bothers to interpret. His damaged eyes can no longer focus properly, seeing only shadows and shapes in a world that has become a nightmare of endless suffering. Yet his body, sustained by the enforced feeding and the honey mixture, continues to cling to life with the stubborn tenacity that makes humans such remarkable creatures. The human organism's refusal to die, even under the most extreme conditions, is essential to the punishment's effectiveness. Death must be slow enough and public enough to serve its deterrent purpose. The psychological dimensions of scaphism extend far beyond Mithridates himself, rippling outward through the empire like stones thrown into still water. Word of his punishment spreads throughout the Persian territories, carried by merchants and soldiers and traveling officials who describe in vivid detail what they witnessed in the palace courtyard. Soldiers who might have considered defection recall his fate and choose loyalty instead. Satraps who harbor dreams of independence remember the 17 days of agony and remain faithful to the crown. Common citizens who might have grumbled about taxes or royal policies think twice about expressing their discontent too openly. The punishment of one man serves to control millions, a calculus that Persian administrators understand and exploit with ruthless efficiency. In distant provinces, local governors share the story as a cautionary tale during public gatherings. They describe the boats, the honey, the flies, the slow descent into madness and death. They emphasize that this fate awaits anyone who dares to contradict the King of Kings, no matter how trivial the contradiction might seem. Religious officials play a complex role in these proceedings. While scaphism is a secular punishment imposed by royal authority, it takes place within a culture deeply influenced by Zoroastrian concepts of purity and contamination. Mithridates' gradual corruption represents not just physical decay, but spiritual pollution, a visible manifestation of the cosmic struggle between good and evil. Some religious authorities view the punishment as necessary purification, cleansing the empire of treachery and rebellion through the systematic destruction of those who challenge divine order. They preach that Mithridates' suffering serves a higher purpose, demonstrating the consequences of defying the god's chosen representative on earth. Others worry privately that the deliberate cultivation of decay and suffering might anger the gods and bring misfortune upon the kingdom. They fear that such extreme cruelty, however justified by law and custom, might violate the natural order that Zoroastrianism seeks to preserve, but none dare speak these concerns aloud. The boats have become a symbol of royal authority that transcends religious considerations. The economic factors that influence the use of scaphism reveal the calculated nature of Persian justice. The punishment is expensive, requiring significant investment of time, personnel, and materials for maximum effect. Teams of guards must work in shifts to provide constant supervision, preventing any rescue attempts and ensuring that the feeding schedule is maintained with mechanical precision. Supplies of honey, milk, and food must be procured and transported to the execution site daily. The honey alone costs more than most Persian farmers earn in a year, imported from the distant mountains where special bees create the purest, sweetest nectar. Officials must manage the crowds, maintaining order while ensuring maximum visibility of the punishment. The boats themselves are works of art, crafted by master carpenters whose skills could be employed in building ships or palaces. Therefore, scaphism is reserved for crimes of particular significance, typically those involving direct threats to royal authority or family. Common criminals might face swift execution, mutilation, or slavery, punishments that serve justice without bankrupting the royal treasury. But scaphism is reserved for cases where the king needs to make a statement that will resonate throughout the empire, where the political benefits justify the enormous costs. By the 10th day, Mithridates is barely recognizable as human. The insects have done their work thoroughly, and his exposed flesh crawls with maggots that have hatched from eggs laid during the first week of his ordeal. They move in writhing masses across his face and hands, some as thick as a man's thumb, tunneling through tissue that has been softened by infection and decay. The smell is overwhelming, a sweet, sick odor that combines rotting flesh with honey and human waste. Even the guards who bring his daily feeding must breathe through cloth masks soaked in perfume. The crowds that gather to witness his suffering now stand much farther back, though they continue to come, drawn by morbid fascination with the spectacle of slow death. Palace physicians are sometimes consulted during this phase, their Hippocratic oath to preserve life twisted into service of prolonged death. They advise the executioners on techniques for keeping the victim alive longer, recommending changes to the feeding schedule or treatments that might prevent fatal complications from developing too quickly. These medical consultations represent one of the most morally complex aspects of the entire system. Healers who have devoted their lives to fighting death find themselves complicit in its most elaborate celebration, their knowledge used to extend suffering rather than alleviate it. Children who witness the boats will grow up with vivid memories of what happens to those who challenge the king. They will pass these stories to their own children, ensuring that the lesson of absolute obedience spreads through generations. Adults carry the images of decay and suffering for the rest of their lives, sharing their experiences with family and friends, thereby spreading the psychological impact of punishment far beyond its immediate audience. Years later, these witnesses will describe in exact detail the progression of Mithridates' deterioration, the sounds he made, the way his body changed color and shape as the days passed. Their testimony becomes part of Persian oral tradition, a shared cultural memory of what absolute power looks like when it decides to demonstrate its reach. The seasonal timing of executions by scaphism is carefully considered by royal officials who understand that weather conditions can make the difference between a successful demonstration of power and a failed spectacle. Summer months provide optimal conditions for insect activity and rapid decomposition, while winter executions might fail to achieve the desired effect due to reduced bug populations and slower bacterial growth. Royal astronomers calculate the ideal timing, considering not just temperature and insect cycles, but also the political calendar. Major executions are timed to coincide with important festivals or diplomatic visits, ensuring maximum public impact and foreign awareness of Persian justice. On the 14th day, something fundamental breaks inside what remains of Mithridates' mind. He stops responding to external stimuli, his mumbled prayers falling silent, his body lying motionless except for the involuntary movements caused by the maggots feeding on his flesh. His breathing becomes shallow and irregular, each inhalation a visible struggle as his damaged lungs work to process air through airways clogged with infected fluid. The crowds sense that the end is approaching. Betting pools form among the spectators, with people wagering on exactly when death will finally claim the condemned man. Some bring musical instruments, preparing to celebrate when the 17-day ordeal reaches its conclusion. Regional variations in the implementation of scaphism reflect local conditions and administrative preferences across the vast Persian Empire. In desert provinces, the boats might be positioned to take advantage of sandstorms that flay exposed flesh while depositing irritating particles in the victim's eyes and mouth. In river valleys, the apparatus might be partially submerged to attract aquatic insects and increase humidity levels that accelerate decay. Coastal regions incorporate salt water into the honey mixture, creating additional chemical burns while preserving the flesh against premature decomposition. These modifications demonstrate the systematic nature of Persian cruelty, the way local officials adapt central directives to maximize suffering within their particular environments. Knowledge of these techniques spreads through administrative networks, creating an empire-wide expertise in the science of prolonged death. The selection of victims for scaphism involves careful political calculation by the king and his advisors. The punishment is most effective when applied to individuals of high status whose fall from grace will shock and intimidate the population. Executing common soldiers by scaphism might be wasteful, while subjecting nobles or royal relatives to the punishment demonstrates that no one is beyond the reach of imperial justice. Artaxerxes' decision to condemn Mithridates, a relatively minor figure who had performed valuable service in killing Cyrus, sends a clear message that even heroism cannot excuse disobedience. The contradiction itself, punishing the man who saved the throne, makes the demonstration of power even more effective, showing that royal authority transcends logic, gratitude, or justice. On the 17th day, as the sun rises over the Persian palace, Mithridates finally dies, not from any single cause, but from the accumulation of 17 days of systematic torture that has destroyed every system in his body. His heart, weakened by infection and dehydration, simply stops beating. His damaged lungs cease their labored breathing. His brain, poisoned by toxins and deprived of proper blood flow, shuts down. Death comes almost quietly, without the drama that has characterized his ordeal. One moment he is breathing, the next he is still. The crowds that have gathered for the final spectacle seem almost disappointed by the anticlimactic ending, though they cheer dutifully when the royal herald announces that justice has been served. But Mithridates' death marks the end of one man's suffering and the beginning of a legend that will haunt human consciousness for over 2 millennia. His name becomes synonymous with the price of contradiction, spoken in whispers by those who understand that in the Persian Empire, truth is whatever the King of Kings says it is, regardless of reality. The boats themselves are cleaned methodically by palace servants who scrub away every trace of their grisly contents. The cedar wood is treated with oils and perfumes to remove the stench of death, then carefully stored in the royal armory alongside other instruments of justice. They will be ready for the next person who forgets that absolute power recognizes no authority but itself. Royal scribes document every detail of the execution in official records that will be preserved in the imperial archives for future reference. These documents serve as both legal precedent and practical manual, ensuring that future applications of scaphism will achieve maximum effectiveness. The bureaucracy of death proves as thorough and systematic as any other aspect of Persian administration. Artaxerxes achieves his goal completely. No one ever again dares to contradict the King of Kings in public, no matter how obvious the lie, no matter how clear the truth. The lesson is too vivid, too horrible to ignore. Royal truth becomes the only truth that matters, and those who remember different versions of events learn to keep their memories to themselves. The international implications of Mithridates' execution extend far beyond Persia's borders, influencing diplomatic relations and military planning throughout the ancient world. Foreign ambassadors who witness the punishment return to their own courts with detailed descriptions of Persian justice, reports that shape their government's policies toward the empire for generations. Greek philosophers incorporate discussions of scaphism into their debates about justice, power, and the nature of tyranny, using the Persian punishment as an example of despotism's ultimate expression. Historians document the execution in works that will survive for millennia, preserving the memory of one man's courage and suffering for future civilizations to contemplate. Today, we might look back at scaphism with horror and disbelief, wondering how such cruelty could ever be considered justice. But the underlying dynamics persist in different forms across cultures and centuries. The isolation of individuals from sources of external support, the creation of hierarchies that reward collaboration with oppression, the normalization of violence as a tool of discipline, and the assurance that those in power face no consequences for their abuse. The legacy of Mithridates serves as a reminder of what happens when power becomes so absolute that it transforms justice into vengeance, law into personal preference, and human beings into instruments of political terror. His story isn't just about ancient history. It's about understanding how systems of oppression function, how they perpetuate themselves across generations, and how they shape entire cultures. Consider modern authoritarian regimes that silence dissent through imprisonment, torture, or death. The methods are different, but the underlying structure remains similar. The isolation of victims from support networks, the use of extreme punishment to deter resistance, the creation of fear so pervasive that truth itself becomes dangerous to speak. Or consider corporate cultures where whistleblowers face retaliation, harassment, and career destruction for exposing wrongdoing. The specific mechanisms of control change, but the underlying patterns remain consistent. Those who challenge official narratives, regardless of their accuracy, face consequences designed to discourage others from similar acts of honesty. What strikes me most about Mithridates' story is not its scale or its cruelty, but the incredible courage it must have taken for him to speak the truth in that throne room. He understood the culture he lived in, the absolute nature of royal authority, the consequences of challenging divine truth. He knew the risks better than anyone, having grown up in a society where the king's word was literally law. Yet he chose to claim credit for the deed that had saved the empire. He chose honesty over safety, recognition over survival, truth over power. In that moment of decision, standing before the most powerful man in the world, he decided that some things were more important than his own life. The courage required for that choice is almost incomprehensible to us. When Mithridates opened his mouth to contradict Artaxerxes, he was choosing certain punishment, probable death, and the likelihood that his family would face consequences for his defiance. He knew that success would likely mean exile or execution, while failure would bring unimaginable torment. Think about what it takes to reach that point. What level of moral conviction would drive someone to choose certain torture over comfortable silence? What strength of character allows a person to value truth more than survival? Mithridates made a choice that most of us will never face, and he made it knowing the full cost. In the end, that moment of courage cost him everything. But it also preserved his story for over 2,000 years, ensuring that somewhere, someone would remember that once, a young Persian soldier chose truth over power, even when he knew the price would be 17 days in the boats. His death was not meaningless. It became a testament to human dignity in the face of absolute power, a reminder that even the most crushing tyranny cannot completely destroy the human capacity for moral choice. Every person who hears his story, who understands what he sacrificed and why, keeps alive the possibility that truth can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The boats are gone now, rotted away centuries ago. The Persian Empire that created them has fallen, its palaces turned to dust, its kings forgotten by all but historians. But Mithridates' choice echoes across time, a whisper of defiance that grows stronger with each retelling. A reminder that in a world where power seeks to define reality, there will always be those willing to pay any price to preserve the truth. If you found this story as disturbing and inspiring as I did, let me know in the comments. What other dark chapters of history reveal similar acts of courage in the face of overwhelming power? Hit that like button if you want to see more forgotten stories like this one, and don't forget to subscribe for more content about the hidden truths of our past. History has so many secrets still waiting to be uncovered, and so many heroes whose names deserve to be remembered.